When you think of a sunken warship, you'll probably think of shellfire, torpedoes, or air attack. If you go far back enough in time, you might also think of ramming. That was an especially popular tactic before the advent of reliable cannon, and even for some time after that. The ram bow would actually endure into the age of steel warships in some form or another. What you probably won't think of, however, is an ocean liner doing the ramming. And yet that did happen on at least one occasion, intentionally. There are a couple other cases of unintentional rammings to go along with it. This video will look at 3 examples, from the intentional to the accidental, all 3 coming from the British, as it turns out. First, let's begin with the unintentional ones, starting with the unfortunate USS Shaw and the massive RMS Aquitania. This story originates in late 1918, towards the tail end of the Great War. On October 9th, 1918, Shaw was escorting Aquitania. The new ocean liner was, at the time, serving as a troop ship, ferrying American troops from North America to the battlefields in Europe. On this particular voyage, Aquitania was doing much the same. There were no issues on her end that I've read about. Shaw, on the other hand, had a malfunction at the worst possible time. During a routine anti-submarine zigzag maneuver, Shaw's rudder jammed. This would have been bad enough under normal circumstances. However, the rudder jammed right as Shaw was angled towards Aquitania. The crew aboard the ocean liner had nowhere near enough time to react, and Shaw's crew couldn't fix the rudder fast enough. This resulted in Shaw ending up right beneath Aquitania's bow as the ocean liner sped along. The massive ship slammed through Shaw, tearing off about 90 feet of the destroyer's bow. The pictures on screen now do a good job of demonstrating how violent this was. Even that probably doesn't hold a candle to actually living through it. Aquitania continued on home for repair work. Shaw, with 12 dead crew and a further 12 wounded, limped along as well. Her crew, through a Herculean effort, managed to keep their ship afloat, in spite of losing everything forward of the bridge and having to fight fires along with the flooding. In fact, Shaw would sail to port under her own power. That was a voyage of 40 miles, which is quite impressive considering the damage. The destroyer was repaired in Portsmouth, England, until the end of May 1919. She would perform one final escort run across the Atlantic before leaving active service. The destroyer was pawned off to the Coast Guard for the Rum Patrol in 1926, and would then be passed back to the Navy when she was too worn out in 1933, before being scrapped in late 1934. Quite a long career, considering the damage Aquitania did to her. As for the liner herself, Aquitania had a long and successful career. She was particularly popular with American passengers, dodging prohibition to get their drinks. Somewhat ironic, considering the role Shaw took up. Regardless, Aquitania would last all the way through the Second World War, once more operating as a troop ship, without ramming an unfortunate escort ship this time around. No, that role was reserved for a newer ship, RMS Queen Mary. This ship is, in the modern day, more famous for being a museum, as well as the reported hauntings that crop up here and there. Alternatively, if you're old enough, her active service as a luxurious and massive ocean liner. The fact that she rammed and sank an escorting cruiser rarely comes up, unless you look past the surface information on the ship. This isn't as surprising as it may sound. Wartime secrecy kept the story under wraps until after the war ended. As for the story, it happened in late 1942. On October 2nd of 1942, Queen Mary was sailing to Britain. In a similar manner to her predecessors in the Great War, the liner was being used as a troop ship. On this particular voyage, she had somewhere around 10,000 American troops aboard from the 29th Infantry Division. With these voyages, Queen Mary used her ocean liner lineage to her advantage. Her best protection was her speed, well in excess of what a U-boat could manage. That, along with zigzagging to avoid torpedoes, was her typical protection. Considering she survived the war in one piece, it certainly worked. This is not to say that Queen Mary sailed without escorts. On October 2nd, the liner rendezvoused with one such escort. North of Ireland, she met up with the cruiser Curaçao, often spelled in a different way, which I'll put on screen, especially in older material. The spelling of her name aside, this cruiser was old. A Great War vintage C-class cruiser, Curaçao had been refit as an anti-aircraft cruiser. Although this refit did little to rectify her aging machinery, leaving the cruiser capable of only 25 knots. Queen Mary, meanwhile, could manage around 29 knots if she was running all out. As established, speed was her best defense, so Queen Mary was running at full speed. While she continued her zigzags, the cruiser stuck to a more straight-line course. This was, in theory, to maximize her anti-aircraft defenses. It did draw the two ships inevitably closer, as Queen Mary's higher speed overtook Curaçao. The result is perhaps predictable, although no less tragic for that. Around 1:30 p.m., Queen Mary was entirely too close to the cruiser for comfort. While the story is a bit confused at this point, it's generally agreed that the first officer, or officer of the watch, noted how close the ships were. The liner's captain told his fellow officers to stay on course. The quote generally goes something like, "They're used to escorting, they'll keep out of the way." The exact wording will differ depending on which source you use, but the spirit of the quote is the same. Queen Mary's captain operated on the assumption that Curaçao's captain would turn his ship to avoid the liner. As it happened, the cruiser stuck to her own course. By 2:04, Queen Mary began a starboard turn. At that point, she was a bit behind Curaçao and only around 400 yards, or 366 meters, away. That was already incredibly close, and the difference in speed between the ships made it worse. Before either crew could really react, Queen Mary overtook her escort, and at full speed, sliced into the side of HMS Curaçao, right amidships. Queen Mary was by no means fit with a ram bow. However, her massive size, far larger than the antique cruiser, more than made up for that. Between the size difference and the sheer speed the liner was running at, she cut clean through Curaçao. Captain Cyril Illingworth is noted as feeling a bump when the collision happened and asking if it was a bomb. The size difference was that extreme. The answer of "No sir, we have hit the cruiser" must have been a gut punch, especially because the liner couldn't stop. Queen Mary was under very strict orders to never stop if she were capable of sailing to avoid U-boats. Once again, we circle back to her best defense was her speed. So, with little choice in the matter, Queen Mary continued on to Britain. To the captain's credit, he did, reportedly, order the escorting destroyers to turn around and pick up survivors. However, it would still take around 2 hours, although some sources say longer, for those ships to arrive. By the time they did, only 99 sailors and 2 officers, 101 men in total, could be rescued. Although this number, along with the number of men lost, has changed over the years. The current accepted number in regard to losses is 337 men. The high casualty figure isn't surprising when you consider how long rescue took, not to mention the fact that Curaçao's stern sank almost immediately, taking whoever was below deck down with it. The bow remained afloat a while longer, but not nearly long enough. Queen Mary had done too much damage, while only suffering relatively minor damage to her own bow in turn. It was a tragedy on all counts, but one that the Royal Navy kept very quiet. The survivors of Curaçao and the witnesses on Queen Mary were sworn to secrecy. The Navy did press charges against Cunard White Star, but it was only after the war ended that this went anywhere, with the result that most of the blame was put on the Navy and Curaçao. 2/3 of the blame, in fact, with only a third going to Queen Mary. It was seen as the cruiser's fault for not evading the liner, not the liner's fault for ramming the cruiser. Even this was after the Royal Navy appealed the original ruling, where all of the blame was laid at their own feet. You can argue who was to blame, and it has been argued ever since. It remains a tragic, and all too often forgotten, story. The final story, meanwhile, is a triumph, not a tragedy. That being the story of RMS Olympic ramming a U-boat, joining HMS Dreadnought in the Large Ship Ramming a Submarine Club, which is actually the second time Olympic was involved in a warship collision. Her incident with HMS Hawk was the first in 1911. However, in that case, it was Hawk colliding with Olympic. For Olympic's turn to be the rammer, we go to the middle of 1918. On May 12, 1918, Olympic was doing much the same duty as the previous two examples, carrying American troops, in this case to France. She was sailing in the English Channel at the time when a submarine was sighted on the surface. This comparatively tiny U-boat was spotted only about 500 meters, 1,600 feet ahead of the ship. Considering the size of the submarine and the fact this was early in the morning, Olympic's lookouts deserve some credit here. That said, her gunners, while quick to open fire, failed to hit the U-boat. Olympic's guns were more designed to defend against surface raiders, not to fire at a small target so far down. It shouldn't be surprising then that her captain, Bertram Hayes, was quick to order a ram. Olympic turned towards the submarine and quickly picked up speed. The Germans, for their part, crash dived to try and avoid the inevitable. While they managed to turn on a parallel course and dove to 30 meters, 98 feet, it was too late. Olympic ran into the submarine aft of the conning tower. That was bad enough, but Olympic's port propeller also hit the boat, slicing through the pressure hull. Unsurprisingly, the crew of U-103 were quick to bring their boat to the surface, and then to abandon ship after scuttling the crippled submarine. Olympic, much like Queen Mary, didn't stop to pick up any survivors. No, she kept right on going, arriving in France soon after. The survivors of U-103, 31 men in total, were picked up by USS Davis later on. Those survivors would reveal that the U-boat was trying to torpedo Olympic, but issues with flooding the torpedo tubes prevented them from doing so. As it turned out, the only damage Olympic suffered was a couple dented hull plates and a twisted prow. That was repaired after she returned to Britain. This is probably the most famous and well-known of the three examples, for admittedly good reason. It was heralded as the only time an ocean liner ran down a U-boat in the Great War. It wasn't swept under the rug like Queen Mary, or just lost to time like Shaw. All three stories are worth remembering, from triumph to tragedy. And if anyone has other examples, by all means let me know. I would be happy to do a follow-up video. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed the content, and I'll see you in the next one.